between the stars, completely alone, picking up sounds that have absolutely no business existing in a place where almost nothing exists at all. Subscribe now before we go any further into this story, because what NASA has confirmed about what Voyager 1 is hearing out there is one of the strangest, most quietly remarkable stories in the entire history of space exploration. Let's start with where Voyager 1 actually is, because most people genuinely have no idea how far this machine has gone. Voyager 1 launched on September 5th, 1977 from Cape Canaveral in Florida. That was nearly half a century ago. Its original mission was straightforward enough. Fly past Jupiter, fly past Saturn, collect data, and send it home. Nobody at NASA seriously expected the spacecraft to still be operating. In 2026, nobody expected it to still be transmitting anything at all. But right now, as of this year, Voyager 1 is approximately 4 billion kilometers from Earth, which works out to roughly 16 billion miles. To put that number in perspective, the distance from Earth to the Sun is about 150 million kilometers. Voyager 1 is currently more than 160 times farther from the Sun than we are. The signal it sends home, traveling at the speed of light, the fastest anything in the universe can possibly travel, takes more than 23 hours just to reach us. And NASA has confirmed that by November 18th, 2026, that signal travel time will hit exactly 24 hours, making Voyager 1 the first human-made object in history to sit one full light day from Earth. The project manager at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, Susie Dodd, explained it simply. If you send Voyager a good morning message at 8 in the morning on Monday, you will receive its response at 8 in the morning on Wednesday. That is not a metaphor. That is the actual operational reality of managing a spacecraft in interstellar space right now in 2026. Now, here is what makes all of this even stranger. Voyager 1 is not just far away. It is in a completely different region of the universe from anything humanity had ever directly sampled before. In August 2012, Voyager 1 crossed a boundary called the helipause, the outermost edge of the heliosphere, the enormous bubble of solar wind and magnetic influence that our sun produces and that surrounds our entire solar system, extending well beyond the orbit of Pluto. When Voyager 1 crossed that boundary, it became the first spacecraft in human history to leave the heliosphere and enter what scientists call the very local interstellar medium, the actual space between stars, not the edge of it, not the outer boundary of the solar system. Interstellar space itself, the realm of the stars, where the sun's influence gives way entirely to the wider fabric of our galaxy. And out there, in that almost unimaginably empty region of space, something unexpected happened. Voyager 1 heard something, not with ears, not through air, because there is no air out there, and sound, as we understand it, cannot travel through the vacuum of space. But the spacecraft's plasma wave system, an instrument built with 2 antenna rods, stretching about 10 meters behind the spacecraft, was designed to detect a different kind of wave entirely. Plasma waves, ripples, and vibrations moving through the thin, ionized gas that permeates even the emptiness of interstellar space. These plasma waves, when converted into audio signals by scientists, produce actual sounds that you can hear. The story of how scientists discovered the specific hum Voyager 1 was picking up is genuinely fascinating. For years after Voyager 1 crossed into interstellar space, the plasma wave system would occasionally detect bursts of plasma oscillation, sharp momentary signals triggered when enormous shock waves produced by the sun, ejections of solar material blasted outward from the sun's surface, traveled all the way to the helipause, and sent ripples reverberating out through the interstellar medium. Astronomers described these events as brief, dramatic moments, like hearing a clap of thunder in an otherwise quiet sky. They gave scientists precise snapshots of the electron density in the interstellar medium at specific moments, but because those shockwave-triggered events were rare, occurring roughly once a year at most, the picture of what interstellar space actually looked and sounded like between those events remained frustratingly sparse. Then, in research published in May 2021 in the journal Nature Astronomy, a team of scientists led by Stella Coe-Air, a doctoral student in astronomy at Cornell University, alongside professors James Cordes and Shemi, Chattery at Cornell, and working with instrument experts Donald Gurnett and William Kerr at the University of Iowa, reported something remarkable. Going back through Voyager 1 data stretching from 2017 onward, they had identified a completely different kind of signal, a faint, persistent, narrowband hum that never went away, not a momentary burst triggered by a solar shock wave, a constant, continuous, barely detectable emission from the interstellar plasma itself, present all the time in the quiet between storms. The blood group system isn't a few thousand years old. It isn't tied to the rise of European kingdoms or Asian dynasties. It's millions of years old, older than our species. Chimpanzees carry A-like blood variants. Gorillas carry B-like variants. The system existed before Homo sapiens walked the earth, before anyone crossed a land bridge, before anyone built a city, before anyone had a nationality to claim. Which means carrying type A blood was never a badge of recent European ancestry. It's a fossil, a genetic fossil inherited from deep in our evolutionary past, then shuffled and locked in by something scientists call the founder effect. When a small group of people breaks away and settles a new region, whatever blood types that small group happen to carry become the dominant blood types of every future generation in that population, regardless of what continent they end up on, regardless of what the myth wants to claim. That's exactly how the Blackfoot Nation ends up with the highest type A frequency on the planet, not European ancestry. A founder effect, a fact locked in tens of thousands of years ago with zero connection to Europe whatsoever. And once you start looking, the pattern shows up everywhere the myth never accounted for. Go south into Central and South America among indigenous populations descended from the earliest migrations across the Bering Land Bridge. Here you find the opposite extreme. Populations that are almost universally type O with type A and type B nearly absent altogether, Peru, Bolivia, parts of the Amazon. Blood type O approaching, and in some isolated groups reaching 100%. Not because these populations lack diversity, because a small founding population crossed into an empty continent carrying almost exclusively the O variant. And every descendant for thousands of years inherited that same narrow genetic starting point. That's the founder effect again. This time producing the opposite extreme from the Blackfoot. Go north instead, to Iceland, settled just over 1,000 years ago by a small founding population of Norse and Gaelic settlers, then isolated by ocean for centuries. Icelandic blood type frequencies still carry the genetic fingerprint of that original small founding group distinct in measurable ways from mainland Scandinavia. Despite obvious shared ancestry, isolation locks patterns in. It doesn't matter whether that isolation happens on a Pacific island, an Arctic island, or the North American plains. The mechanism is identical everywhere on Earth. Now go to the Sahel and West Africa. Populations across Nigeria and neighboring regions show type A frequencies that directly overlap with parts of Europe, and some surveys exceeding them. Meanwhile, right inside Europe itself, the Basque population of northern Spain and southern France, one of the most ancient genetically distinct groups in Europe with a language unrelated to any other on Earth, shows unusually low type A and unusually high type O, breaking the European pattern from within Europe's own borders. Let that sink in. The myth doesn't even hold up inside Europe. And here's a detail that makes the whole biochemical race index even more disturbing once you know it. This wasn't just a forgotten academic paper that quietly disappeared. Ideas like the Hirschfeld's race index fed directly into the racial pseudoscience that European fascist movements leaned on in the following decades. A ranking system built to sort populations from more evolved to more primitive based on a blood test is exactly the kind of tool a regime looking to justify hierarchy would want to seize on. The myth wasn't just wrong, it was dangerous, and it still gets repeated today by people who have no idea where it actually came from, stripped of that history, shrunk down into a piece of harmless-sounding dinner table trivia. It was never harmless. It just got rebranded as harmless once the original context faded from memory. Let's go even further, because there's another blood marker people confuse with all of this, and untangling it makes the real picture even clearer. Rh factor, the positive or negative sign after your blood type. You've probably heard that Rh negative blood is the rare, mysterious European bloodline, sometimes even wrapped in stranger internet claims about ancient origins. Here's the actual data. Rh negative frequency is genuinely higher in parts of Europe, especially concentrated among the Basque population, the same ancient isolated group that broke the type A pattern earlier in this video. But Rh negative isn't uniquely European either. It shows up at lower, but real, frequencies across North Africa, the Middle East, and parts of South Asia. Once again, a trait that looks like a tidy national marker turns out to be a scattered ancient pattern shaped by isolation and founder populations, not a clean line drawn around one continent. Now, let's look at one more population, because it destroys yet another version of this myth. Ashkenazi Jewish populations, historically concentrated across Central and Eastern Europe for centuries, might seem like the perfect test case for the geography. Determines blood type theory. And yet, genetic surveys show Ashkenazi Jewish type A and type B frequencies tracking closer to older Middle Eastern population patterns than to the surrounding European nations they lived alongside for generations. Centuries of geographic proximity to Europe didn't overwrite a deeper, older genetic signature. That's not a flaw in the data. That's the founder effect working exactly the way it always works, holding firm across centuries, regardless of which flag flew over the land a population happened to live on. Every single one of these examples points to the exact same conclusion from completely different corners of the planet. blood type, frequency tracks, migration, isolation, and deep ancestry. It does not track nationality. It never did. There's a second myth riding on the back of this first one, and it deserves to be taken apart, too. You may have heard of the blood type diet. The idea that type O people should eat like ancient hunters heavy on meat, while type A people should eat like ancient farmers. Mostly plants, because blood type supposedly reflects which evolutionary stage your ancestors reached first. It sounds compelling. It has sold millions of books, and it has been tested directly repeatedly by nutrition scientists and found to have no measurable basis in reality. People on these diets did sometimes see health improvements, but follow-up research showed the improvements came from cutting processed food and sugar, not from matching food to blood type. The diet worked. The blood type explanation behind it didn't. Same pattern as the European myth. A tidy story surviving long after the evidence stopped supporting it. Now compare that to Australia. Aboriginal Australian populations isolated on that continent for tens of thousands of years, with essentially zero external gene flow until the last few centuries, show their own distinct blood type distribution, generally dominated heavily by type O, with type A and type B present only in relatively low frequencies in most traditional communities. Another isolated founder population. Another data point that has nothing whatsoever to do with Europe, and yet lines up perfectly with the same founder effect explanation, driving every other example in this video. Iceland, Peru, the Blackfoot Nation, Ireland, Australia, different continents, different histories, completely unconnected migrations, and the exact same underlying mechanism explaining all of it. That consistency is what real science looks like. A single mechanism, founder effect in isolation, correctly predicting blood type patterns everywhere on the planet, in populations that never had any contact with each other. Compare that to the 1919 race index, which couldn't even correctly predict the pattern within Europe itself. This is also why modern ancestry science moved away from single marker tests entirely. A blood type test looks at one gene. Modern autosomal DNA testing looks at anywhere, from several 100,000 to over 1 million positions across your genome simultaneously, cross-referencing patterns, against reference populations built from thousands of documented family histories. That density is what allows modern testing to distinguish, for example, Northern European ancestry from Southern European ancestry or West African ancestry, from East African ancestry, at a resolution a single blood type marker could never approach. Even in theory, one gene gives you one small inherited marker from ancestors going back millions of years. 1 million genetic markers give you an actual map. That's the real difference between a 100-year-old wartime myth and modern genetic science. And it's the entire reason serious researchers abandoned blood type-based ancestry claims decades ago, even while the myth kept circulating everywhere else. So here is the full, uncomfortable truth. Type A is the European blood type was never a scientific fact. It was a wartime ranking system invented by 2 researchers with a small biased sample wrapped in scientific language to make it sound objective and then repeated for a century because tidy stories spread faster than complicated truths. And there's one more piece of this puzzle worth understanding, because it's the closest thing to a real evidence-backed reason. Blood type frequencies cluster the way they do, and it has nothing to do with race disease, specifically resistance to certain infections. Researchers have found associations between blood type and susceptibility to diseases like cholera, certain strains of malaria, and even more recently, some viral infections where one blood type shows a measurable survival advantage over another in a specific disease environment. That means in regions where a particular disease was historically brutal, natural selection could have quietly pushed a population's blood type frequency in one direction over thousands of years, favoring whichever type happened to offer better odds of survival in that specific environment. This is a real testable evolutionary explanation. And notice what it depends on. Local disease environment, not nationality, not race. A population living through repeated cholera outbreaks in one region, and a population living through a completely different disease environment on another continent could end up with completely different blood type frequencies for reasons that have nothing to do with ancestry lining up with modern borders. It's another mechanism alongside the founder effect quietly shaping the map. And once again, it explains the real data far better than a wartime ranking system ever could. Put those two mechanisms together, founder effect and disease resistance, and suddenly every strange result in this video makes perfect sense. The Blackfoot Nation's extreme type A frequency. Japan rivaling Scandinavia. The Basque Country breaking the pattern from inside Europe. Ireland's O-heavy population sitting at the geographic center of the myth. Peru's near universal typo. Every one of those results looks like chaos. If you're still holding on to the 1919 racial ranking, Every one of those results looks completely predictable the moment you understand founder effects and disease pressure instead. That's the difference between a myth and a real scientific explanation. A myth requires you to ignore the exceptions. Real science explains them. Here's what should replace it. Blood. Type comes from a single gene. One gene out of roughly 20,000 in the human genome. One gene cannot tell you where your ancestors came from. It's one coin flip from millions of years ago, shaped by founder effects and genetic drift, not a passport stamp, if you actually want to trace ancestry, real science. Today looks at hundreds of thousands of positions across your entire genome at once. The kind of deep autosomal testing that can trace regional ancestry with real precision, distinguishing not just continent of origin, but specific regions within continents, tracking migration events going back centuries. A single blood type marker was never capable of that. It never will be. So next time someone repeats that old line, type A, that's the European blood type, you'll know exactly where it came from. A 100-year-old wartime ranking system. And you'll know exactly why it's wrong. Because the highest type A frequency ever recorded on Earth belongs to an indigenous nation in North America, not a single country in Europe. It hasn't, because myths don't die from evidence. They die when enough people finally hear the real story. Consider this the moment you heard it. This is exactly what this channel exists to do. Every trait, every blood type, every physical feature carries a real history buried underneath a century of repeated myths. And almost every time, the real story is more shocking than the myth that replaced it. Comment your blood type below right now. Tell me if you'd ever heard this myth before today, and if you want the full breakdown of type B, type O, and type A. Next, the myths, the real global maps, the populations nobody expects. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because that video is coming and you don't want to miss it. One more thing before you go, because this connects everything together. Scientists didn't throw out blood type mapping entirely. They just stopped forcing it into a racial ranking. Used correctly alongside deeper genetic markers, frequencies can actually help trace real human migration out of Africa, across Eurasia, into the Americas, out into the Pacific. Researchers studying the spread of early farming across Neolithic Europe used shifts in blood type frequency layered with other genetic markers to help map how farming populations from the Fertile Crescent gradually mixed with existing hunter-gatherer groups already living across the continent. The mistake was never noticing that blood type varies by population. That part was true. The mistake was assuming that variation matched the racial categories people already believed in instead of following where the evidence actually pointed. That's the real lesson hiding inside this entire story. Genetics doesn't care about the borders humans draw on a map. It doesn't organize itself around nationality or the assumptions of any era scientists. It organizes itself around migration, isolation, and time. Time scales so vast that modern racial categories don't even register. The Blackfoot Nation, sitting at the top of the world's Type A rankings, isn't a strange exception. It's proof the entire theory was broken from the day it was invented. Think about what that actually means for you watching this right now. If you carry Type A blood, you are not carrying a stamp that says European. You are carrying a piece of a puzzle that connects you distantly to Blackfoot elders in Montana, to families across Japan, to farmers who lived in the Fertile Crescent thousands of years before. Written history. To ancestors far older than any nation that exists today. That is a far bigger story than the one you were originally told, and it happens to be true. It's worth sitting with why a myth this shaky lasted an entire century in the first place. Part of it is that blood type is one of the only pieces of genetic information most people actually know about themselves. Printed on a donor card or mentioned once by a doctor, which makes it feel personal and important, even though biologically it's a tiny fragment of who you are. Part of it is that the original 1919 study came wrapped in the language of hard science, published by credentialed researchers at a time when almost nobody had the tools to fact-check it against global data. And part of it is simply that nobody went looking for the Blackfoot Nation's numbers or Ireland's numbers or Japan's numbers until decades later, by which point the myth had already been repeated by enough people and enough classrooms, enough family conversations, enough magazine articles that it no longer felt like a claim that needed checking at all. That's how myths outlive the evidence against them. Not because the evidence doesn't exist, because nobody goes looking for it until someone finally puts it all in front of you the way this video just did. So the next time somebody claims a blood type belongs to a nationality, you already know the truth. Blood type doesn't have a passport. It has a family tree that stretches back millions of years, long before Europe, long before Asia, long before anyone on this planet had a flag to call their own. If this flipped everything you thought you knew, hit subscribe. hit the bell, and I'll see you in the next video where we're taking apart another trait you've probably been told a completely wrong story about. And if there's one thing worth carrying with you after this, let it be this. Every time a piece of trivia sounds too clean, too simple, too perfectly matched to a category, humans invented a nationality, a race, a border on a map. That's exactly the moment to get curious instead of repeating it. Real biology is messier than that. Real history is messier than that. And almost every time when you actually dig into the mess, what's hiding underneath is far more interesting than the tidy myth sitting on top of it. That's what happened with type A blood. That's what happens with trait after trait. Once you stop accepting the easy answer and start asking who actually checked it, and against what data, this channel exists to keep doing exactly that. Video after video, myth after myth. See you in the